Hello and welcome everyone to Eastern Roman history. Today we shall be talking about the reign of the second emperor of the Empire of Trebizond, Andronikos I Gidon. I am your host Daniel Maynard, and I am joined by Mark, an expert on the subject of Trebizond. Hello Mark.
Hello Daniel, thank you for having me back.
It's good to have you here. First we shall cover the reign of Andronicus himself, and then we shall answer and discuss some questions around his reign. That's pretty much it. So, I'd just like to say thank you all for joining us, and let's begin. So, the reign of Andronicus I Gidon. He was married to the eldest unnamed daughter of Alexios I, Grand Comnenus, and he ascended the throne when his predecessor Alexios I died. One of the first acts he did was to renew a peace treaty that his predecessor had made with the Seljuk Sultan in the year 1222. In 1223, a ship containing the tithes and taxes from the Trebizondine Crimean provinces, as well as its archon, responsible for collecting the said taxes, were caught in a storm and had to stop at Sinope. The city's governor, a man called Hetum, threw the archon and the crew of the ship in prison and confiscated everything on the ship as well as the ship itself. Not only this, but Hetum also launched ships to attack and raid Cherson in the Crimea. Andronicus responded by sending the Trebizondine navy against Sinope. The sailors attacked the harbour of Sinope and killing and capturing many of their crews, and then they raided everything around the city. The sailors exchanged the prisoners they had taken for everything that Hetum had stolen. He released his prisoners, as well as returned all of the loot recently taken from Cherson. The success of the Trebizondines caused Sultan Melik, the ruler of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, to launch a massive invasion of Trebizond with the intention of conquering the city and empire. Andronicus responded appropriately. He fortified the passes toward the city and gathered the provincials into its walls. As Melik's vanguard advanced, Andronicus I, Theodore the Polemarch, and George Akrivitsiotis, led an army and defeated the Turks. Andronicus then withdrew his forces into Trebizond. Melik besieged the city and burned everything outside of it. Melik assaulted the walls facing the sea, but was repulsed when Andronicus personally led a sally against the attackers. Andronicus pursued the routing Turks and plundered their siege camp. Hetum, the governor of Sinope, who was in the Seljuk army, was killed in the sally. Andronicus returned to Trebizond. Later, Melik ordered his army to attack the city again. This Turkish assault was also defeated. Andronicus I invited Melik to sue for peace. Melik sent his ambassadors into Trebizond, who reported back to him that the city was still brimming with supplies. The only way to take it would be by assault. Melik, trusting to the favourable signs of his astrologers, launched a night attack on Trebizond. That same night, the attackers were bogged down by torrential rain and thunderstorms, preventing them from attacking. In the dark, some of the Seljuks rode off hidden cliffs, and others drowned or were dragged away by the torrents. Melik withdrew, but was captured by Trebizondine mountaineers from Matzuka. A chapel to St. Eugenios was erected to mark the spot of the Sultan's capture. With the Sultan's capture and the near total annihilation of the Sultan's massive army, Andronicus I exacted the following terms. Trebizond's vassalage to the Turks was annulled, and Trebizond was no longer obligated to send the Sultan troops or tribute. In essence, this treaty completely reversed the one that Kaikabad had made with Alexios I in 1214. The moderation of these terms impressed Melik so much that he sent a tribute of Arab horses and money for the monastery of St. Eugenius and the church of the Golden-Headed Virgin in the Empire of Trebizond annually. In 1229, Andronicus wanted to exploit the conflict between the Persian Shah Jalal ad-Din and the Seljuk Sultan. He made an alliance with the Shah against the Seljuks, perhaps in the hopes of conquering new territories as well as placate the bellicose Persians. Sending an army with the Persians, the allies were defeated by the Turks at the Battle of Yassi Chemen on the 10th to 12th of August 1230. This defeat allowed the Seljuks to reimpose the vassal status of Trebizond, which it had been under before 1223. Vincent de Bouvet in 1240 says the Trebizondines provided 200 lances or 1,000 soldiers to the Seljuk Sultan. The Mongols occupied the region of Lazica on the Empire of Trebizond's eastern frontier at some point during Andronicus's reign. Andronicus I minted bronze coins called skyphates, which was the first instance of a Trebizondine ruler minting bronze coins. In 1235, Andronikos I Gidon died. Andronicus does not seem to have had any children with his wife, and so the throne passed to Alexios I's eldest son, John I Grand Comnenus, or Zukos. Mark, do you have anything you would like to add to my summary of his reign? Mark? Well, while Mark sorts himself out, so, on the whole, there are some questions that Andronicus's reign does throw up. For instance, Andronicus I Gidon is one of two emperors of Trebizond that were not members of the Grand Comnenus family. And it is interesting in how to ask the question of how he got his throne, and also, although the circumstances themselves don't survive to us, to try and speculate a little as to perhaps how and why Andronicus I was chosen over Alexios I's natural son, John I. Some of the evidence, one idea is that perhaps John I was not old enough to rule, and so Andronicus became the best man for the job in the circumstances. Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can. Oh, there we go. So as you're here, do you have anything you would like to add to my rundown of the empire of Andronicus I's reign?
No, not particularly. There was a very, very, very good rundown of it. The some of the more specific things I think we can address in a bit.
So at the moment, we're just talking about how did Andronicus Gidon become emperor. I was saying how it has been speculated, but it's not certain, and there's no specific evidence for it that John I was not old enough to be for the Trebizondine court to be confident with him taking the throne, and so gave it to Andronicus instead.
Yes, I mean, I do think that is the most likely explanation. I mean, I know there is an issue with one of the accounts of Alexios's reign mentioning he has an adult son.
Yes, there is a Turkish historian that quotes the people of Sinop, stating that the Seljuk Sultan threatens the people of Sinop that he would kill Alexios I, Grand Kemnemnos, if they did not surrender the city, and they reply that go ahead, but we will not surrender the city, for he has grown sons in Trebizond. Now, as much as that might very well be true, because of how vague it is, a grown son could be a 14-year-old or something like that, and it doesn't. It acknowledges the fact that Alexios did have an heir, a natural heir, but it's not concrete evidence that that his sons were actually adults by that time.
Yes, I mean, I think there is definitely. I mean, whether or not he was truly of age or not, unfortunately, we can't tell exactly. But I think what is certain is that the nobility of Trebizond did not think he was either of an age to successfully lead the empire in this time of crisis. And it was a time of crisis at this point, with the reversals on the north coast of Anatolia. So I mean, this sort of comes hand in hand. My own view of it is hand in hand with the debate regarding the identity of Andronikos. Because if he is the same Andronikos Gidon as the general of the Nicene Empire, then I think it makes a lot more sense that he is therefore the man, like the nobility would go to him and thrust the mantle of rule onto him. But I think what is interesting, and this is why I mean, promise this is all down to speculation, but with regards to some evidence, what I find very telling is on his coins. On Andronicus's coins, he uses the term despot, especially towards his latter ones. Rather interestingly, he marks them with despot rather than basileus or any other sort of imperial type of
title.
So it's despot, which I think could sort of suggest that he's almost a caretaker ruler.
Perhaps even a regent.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps not like how we would think of a regency, or how, but sort of, he's probably oldish by this point, probably quite old. So therefore, the nobility of Trebizond perhaps thought if we put him on the throne, he isn't going to rule for long, but he's the man we need at the moment. And then by the time he's dead, Alexios' son John will be of a good mature age, and he'll be able to rule responsibly. I mean that's perhaps it is overemphasizing the presence of despot on Andronicus's coins, but there's little other evidence, unfortunately, for this particular decision.
I think when it comes to especially Trebizond, with its lack of evidence for much of the stuff, you have to be perhaps a little more accepting of mental gymnastics and speculation, because otherwise it trying to make sense of the history of I don't know is not very informative.
Yes, I mean Trebizond, the study of Trebizond, it requires a good deal of
further study,
reasoning with what you have.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I would agree that there definitely has to be a reason for why Andronicus, this man who was outside of the ruling dynasty, was selected to be emperor of the empire at that time. It seems even though the empire was still fairly new, I still think he would struggle to kind of, I will just insert my own dynasty into the state of affairs, because not only was Alexios the first emperor of Trebizond, but also he is the next ruler along in a long line of Komnenian emperors going back all the way to Alexios I and Isaac I Komnenos in the 11th century. So if you think about it too microscopically, that nuance might get missed. But if they're basing their legitimacy on the fact that their ancestors were the Roman emperors, and now they are also the Roman emperors, just ignore that upstart in Nicaea, I think there must have been a reason why Guidon was able to insert himself as emperor into this Komnenian empire, and might also explain why he didn't have any children, or perhaps even if he did, the dynasty may have returned to the Komnenians anyway. What do you think of that?
Yes. I mean that's part of the reason why I think he may have been a caretaker ruler. But I think one can't emphasize enough how perhaps not so much at this early stage, but I still think it's there enough how tied up the Komnenian dynasty is with the position of being emperor. Obviously they still claimed the Roman the imperial crown at this point. So it is an interesting speculation, perhaps, that Andronicus may not have. Perhaps another reason for that despot is perhaps he did not wish to claim the imperial crown if he was indeed a general of the Niceans. But I think it would have been very hard for him to have just immediately just set up his own, seize the crown for himself, even with the sport nobility. There would have been, because the Komnenian family is very much an important part of that empire. Remember, it had been around for nearly 20 years by this point. So So I am of the opinion that he was probably a caretaker. He was probably the good military man who was needed at the time. And I think that even if he did have children, I think it was almost the case that the throne was always going to revert back to John I.
Yeah.
On Andronicus's death.
So I think we'll take a couple of questions from our audience members before we return to the discussion. So, what were the conquests? What were the circumstances that led to the Trebizondine conquests of the other side of the Black Sea coast? I assume that is referring to the Crimea. Forgive me if I'm incorrect, but so the Byzantine Empire before the era of the Empire of Trebizond did actually own some territory on the coast of the Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. And as the empire fell apart at the time of the Fourth Crusade, that region just kind of, it floats out of the imperial sphere, as in they're no longer sending taxes that way, but they are still Roman. And during the reign of Alexios I, at some point, he conquers or reimposes his authority over the region, and the Crimea continues to be an important province in the Empire of Trebizond for many decades to come. Okay, let's continue with our questions. So, Mark, do you think that Andronikos I Gidon was the same person as Andronikos Gaidos, the man that commanded Theodore Lascaris' troops during the Battle of the Rough Ways in 1206?
Well, yes, I do. But like other historians, some quite big names who do also think he is the same, there's no real evidence to prove it. My whole belief why he is the same is because, aside from the fact that he's in the area, he also, it helps to explain why he becomes emperor. He's a good, successful military commander. But as I said, there's no evidence to suggest in either direction, aside from the similarities, the near identicality even of his surname
and his name in general.
Yes, I mean, you can easily argue against it by saying, well, why would the people of Trebizond, especially those the nobility there who are loyal to the common emperors, accept him as emperor? And I can't answer that. But I think, perhaps it's just the neatness of it, perhaps, which lends me to think he is the same. But as it is, any argument in either direction is based on a huge amount of speculation. So I think he is, but it's just a view, and I have no real evidence to support it.
Nicely put. So one of the sources for the reign of Andronicus Gidon is Michael Panaretos, who is the only known chronicler from Trebizond who documented their history. And there's an interesting thing he mentions about the end of Andronicus's reign, which links in with John I's reign, and he says that John I reigned for 6 years, but he also states that he died 3 years into his reign. So why does Panaretos mention these two figures, these two numbers? Do you think do you think that he just got his numbers wrong, or is there perhaps something more to it? Do you think we could read into that a little more? And if so, why?
Well, I don't think he did get his numbers wrong, or at least I don't think he got them intentionally wrong. He states explicitly that Guidon dies in 1235. And then, it's very much, it's in the next sentence goes, John I reigned 6 years, died year 1238. Apologies to keep going back to my view that he was a caretaker, but it could be at this point that perhaps he's getting on a bit, perhaps he's getting elderly. John perhaps becomes co-emperor, or perhaps takes over the day-to-day running of the empire, or perhaps it could explain why a lot of, perhaps could even explain, if we go really deep into it, why a lot of the later coins have despot on them, perhaps because at that point you could even almost argue that he subordinates himself to John.
Become junior emperor of a kind.
Yes.
Or at least co-emperor.
Yes, I suspect more co-emperor, as much as it would be. It's just, I just don't think I've seen anything to suggest he could have been junior emperor. It just doesn't strike me as a thing. But I think it's almost the most likely thing is that for the last 3 years of Andronicus' reign, we have John as co-emperor with him.
I do think that is the most likely explanation for why Panaretos says 6 years, especially if you think about how Roman historians number the years of an emperor's reign. They do it not how we do it today, where we do it from their sole reign, almost. So like the reign of Basil II, for us, basically begins in 976. But if you were Roman, his reign would have started immediately after his father Romanus II died. And that's how, and they would say he ruled 60 years or whatever it is. He ruled for 6 years with Emperor Nicephorus Phocas. He ruled for another 8, I think, with John, and then 54 alone, or something like that. I think if Panaretos was perhaps writing a larger, a proper history rather than just historical footnotes, he may have explained it away in that way, if indeed he was correct, which I do think he was. What do you think, Mark? Do you think that's possible?
Yes. Yes. I mean, you are correct in that the dating by Byzantine historians of emperors' reigns is certainly at times different to ours. I mean, you could always say that he did make a mistake with his numbers, but I just don't. I don't think that's particularly likely.
Yeah. Yeah. So okay, I think it's an interesting point to cover in a way, because it because it's such a kind of mysterious and there's not that much evidence. You have to try and take what you can get and try and link them together. And I think if you start seeing trends, or the like perhaps or there is a, you can use Occam's razor to it's one explanation is this, or perhaps there is something a bit more to it. It's possible that that actually did happen. Does that make sense? Or am I just waffling?
Yes. No, it doesn't. Yes.
Okay then. So, Mark, why do you think Andronicus pursued such a moderate treaty with the Seljuks? Why did he not ask for sign-offs back?
I think part of the issue is that he has been exhausted by this siege. Trebizond's resources, whilst they were able to carry out a number of good sallies against the Seljuks, the amount of damage which was caused both to the periphery of Trebizond and to a lot of the and the attempts to scale the walls means that I think there is an element there of the fact that Andronicus may not have thought that he could have held on to Sinop, for example, if he had demanded it. He could have been quite a conservative man in that regard, perhaps not wanting to bite off too much more than he could chew. But of course, then how do you reconcile that with his Persian goings on later in his reign? Is my only issue with that. But I suspect it's probably that he didn't want to overstretch his small empire.
I would agree. I would agree.
I can't think of any other explanation really, which makes sense.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, at least in 1223, if say he did ask for Sinop back and some money and so on, all the Seljuk Sultan would need to do is raise another army and then invade Trebizond again, and he'd more than likely be able to retake it, because as much as Trebizond was quite rich and defensible, he had already come close to conquering its capital. So I think Andronicus, perhaps in a long-term way, thought that it was better to have a placated Seljuk Sultan and maintain their independence with what they had, rather than try and risk everything being too greedy. And perhaps and that leads us into our the next question of why did Andronicus join up with the Persians? Perhaps at that point, after it had been a few years, the country had recovered a bit, and the great promises of the Shah may have given him enough confidence to go, okay, maybe now is the time to try and take a bigger risk. And like any risk, there's always a chance that you can lose, and I'm afraid that's exactly what happened. What do you think?
Yes, I think that's a fair appraisal, or perhaps what of the situation later on in his reign. I'd say it's hard to reconcile the two, but I think with that hypothesis, you have managed to do so.
Thank you very much.
I mean, the again after David's earlier conquest, it doesn't have an expansion on that scale.
Yeah.
But that could have been the key to its longevity, of course.
They were very good at keeping what they had, rather than trying to risk everything in a few minor conquests in Pontus. Maybe. Mark, this is a question for you, which I think you know far more than I do. Could you tell us a little bit more about the siege of Trebizond, more specifically, like a little bit more of what happened?
Yes. After Andronicus' withdrawal to the city, Melik, of course, then tries to take it, through scaling the walls and the usual apparatus of medieval siege tactics. And Andronicus did a series of sallies against parts of Melik's army. So
I think we may have lost
fighting all of Melik's army at once. So he'd sally out, usually with cavalry, attack part of Melik's army, and then withdraw back to the city in time before Melik could bring his full force to bear. And Melik was getting very frustrated by this tactic by Andronikos.
Yeah.
But there is in Lazaroupolis, which is the best source for the siege, and unfortunately it's a pain to get hold of. But if anyone does have, any of your good loyal listeners do have a copy of it, I'd highly recommend they do read the part concerning the siege of Trebizond. But there's this great little bit where it did sort of get desperate for a bit of time, although he was able to show to the envoys that he had huge supplies of food and military equipment. Lazaroupolis gives a different view of it, and there's this whole incident where Andronicus is up on the city walls in tears, calling upon God and Saint Eugenius for help. And then he led the Bishop of Trebizond and abbots from the monastery of Saint Eugenius. They did a procession around the city walls of Trebizond, carrying the head of Saint Eugenius and Trebizond's own Hogetria icon. The Hogetria icon depicts the Virgin Mary carrying an infant Christ. And it draws. It echoes some of the processions along the Theodosian walls in the sieges of Constantinople back in the
various sieges of Constantinople.
Which but what and then there are some academics who disagree with me a lot about this. I won't put too big a. But whatever happened, whatever did happen, perhaps there was obviously going to be some sort of religious goings on within Trebizond at the time of a siege, and then of course a great storm happens. Lazaroupolis inserts Saint Eugenius into the actual story as getting Melik, trapping Melik, causing Melik's forces to attack in the storm, and
his entire army being destroyed.
Yes, it isn't only Lazaroupolis which says that his whole army gets destroyed. Panaretos states that nearly all of Melik's army is lost. So, I mean, I suspect that the storm dispersed, and in some of the gullies, perhaps it was such a big storm that perhaps a lot drowned. But what the storm undoubtedly, even though perhaps Trebizond could have held.
Yeah, it's natural disasters like that can really
Melik siege of the city
changes.
I think.
It's natural disasters like that can really save a situation. And to bring us on to our last question for today, was Andronicus I a successful emperor? I'll go first, and then we can say your bit if you want, Mark. So, how I see Andronicus's reign is, it reminds me a little bit of Manuel II, in that he was a very competent emperor, and he managed to see the empire through a very uncertain times and a very rough period, and he made some gambles that in some cases won and in other cases lost out. But I think I would say that Andronicus I was a successful emperor, even though his circumstances at the beginning of his reign were virtually the same at the end of his reign. It did mean that the Empire of Trebizond had survived beyond the first generation, and through John's reign, and then later on, the empire kept going. So, in some respects, thanks to Andronicus I, the empire was able to resist the Turks and continue to be a factor in the region for the rest of the medieval period.
Yes,
how would you evaluate his reign, Mark?
The stability of Andronicus's reign is remarkable, but it was undoubtedly successful, mainly because the empire does survive. It was in a.
I think that perhaps we lost you there.
And aside from the emperors in the Civil War, you'd say most emperors did do a reasonable job. I'll start again. I think he was successful. His undoubtedly, his defence of Trebizond was, it speaks for itself. Trebizond wasn't destroyed. He isn't by no means, one who expanded the empire, but in terms of ensuring his empire survived, he's as successful as any emperor. Where he comes in terms of a metric of the Trebizondine emperors, I couldn't quite say, and I wouldn't try and put him on a scale saying he's successful or not. But I would say that he did what he was there to do, which I suspect he was put into power to do, which was to save the empire from a militarily perilous situation, and that is what he did. Yes, that's also long term. I did want to mention that it's perhaps because of the siege of Trebizond that the cult of Saint Eugenius grew into the patron saint. Eugenius became patron saint of Trebizond. You can see from most emperors who minted coins after Andronicus, you have Saint Eugenius on their coins. And it's before him. Unfortunately, we have no examples, but on his coins we do not see Saint Eugenius. Mainly, we see an image of
Christ,
the Virgin, of the Virgin Mary, or Christ on the reverse and St. George on the obverse. After his reign, you see St. Eugenius on a lot of coins, which perhaps meant that the divine intervention of St. Eugenius during the siege perhaps became part of the overall identity of the Empire of Trebizond.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about any of that before. Well, didn't know about that. So thank you, Mark. That was very interesting. And I think that's about it in many ways. I think we've said everything that we can say about Andronicus I. Mark, would you like to answer a question or two from the audience, or shall we wrap it up? The floor is yours. I think we shall wrap it up then, as there don't seem to have been that many questions.
Combination and their official title was.
So I think we lost you there, Mark. Yes, so I think we'll wrap it up there then. So I'd like to thank everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed our little discussion about the Emperor Andronicus I of Trebizond. And I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much for watching. And thank you, Mark, for participating. And this has been Eastern Roman History.